Hey guys, this is Pastor John here for Inverted Podcast number 4, and we're so glad you have joined us. The Inverted Podcast is about taking the things of Scripture that sometimes seems backwards and upside down and living them out in our life to find the purpose in which Jesus has called us to. Today, we have a guest with us. I guess you're not a guest though, right?
Well, I am a guest.
You're a guest to our podcast, but not really a guest to the church. So who are you?
Well, my name is Heather Gossett.
Well, hi, Heather, and
Hello.
welcome to Inverted Podcast number 4.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I've been coming to Timber Ridge for several years now, and had the opportunity to be the interim worship director for a while, and now I just get to be a part of the congregation and be a witness.
And with that, obviously, I've given you not a script, but some questions. Who were you when you entered the church here, and who are you leaving as?
I entered the church as a very frail, I don't want to necessarily say shell of a person, but shell of a person. I didn't know my identity, didn't understand worth, where it was placed, and just really had no way to be able to make decisions for myself and be confident in the decisions and the directions where the Lord was leading me. And I can confidently say that through the experiences and opportunities of leading here and being shaped and poured into by a lot of the spiritual leaders, that I am 100% know where my worth's at, my identity is found, and I'm confident than ever.
Very cool. So you were new to the church world then, or did you grow up in church and around church?
I grew up in church and around church.
Okay.
Grew up in a Baptist roots, and then moved to non-denominational 5th through high school, and then kind of when I came to college, I say that those years were kind of like my parents' faith years with me.
Yes.
But when I got here, that this was really the opportunity where I took my own faith in my own hands, and I could either pour into that or not. Right.
And it's interesting to even think about the idea that people can be a part of church and part of their parents' faith, and then still have a question about their identity. Mm-hmm. What brought you to a greater identity of who you are in Christ here versus growing up around the church and in the church?
Mm-hmm. I would say really getting involved in serving and seeing his goodness and faithfulness, and understanding that whatever step I took, it wasn't necessarily the wrong direction, but that God just needs us to be willing to move sometimes. Right. And he can still take over and lead that, because I was paralyzed to make so many decisions. And, I had the world at my hands, at my disposal when I first got to college. And it was which choice am I going to make? And
Well, not too long. What's going to be going on in your life? What's the next steps?
Yeah, I am getting married.
Yes.
Yep. So August 4th. It'll be here before we know it.
And you, the person on the other side of this, is part of it. I guess he can speak now too, right?
I can.
Okay.
I'll finally make my podcast debut. Edited and recorded all these in the behind the scenes.
So good. I'm glad you're checking in. What do you love about this lady of yours, or soon to be wife of yours?
Well, I guess I was going to stare right at you when I tell you this. But I can't give too much away because I still have my vows that I'm writing.
That's true.
Sue. But no, I know that, no matter what we have in our life, she's always going to put God first. And I think I keep saying I know that is what is always important. And then she really sometimes at a fault where I'm like, hey, you can be selfish at times, of just really wants to serve and just be loving towards me and for me, and I like doing and reciprocating that because of that.
Yes.
And so the fact that she puts God first, but then is so giving with her time to sometimes to a fault, literally, that's what really drew me towards her. But she I would say that, and I'm just gonna tell everybody, because she did have a crush on me first, for sure she did, because she reminds me, she goes, you finally wised up, which I did. But I was going through a lot at that time.
You had some growing up to do.
I did. No, as much as I'm going to tell the people, honestly, yes. And that's okay to say that. But it was. And Heather had some growing too, but I wouldn't say so much as the spiritual side of things as much. I think there was, and you could talk about that today if you wanted to.
Right.
But mine was a different type of growing up, and I think when you don't have that, I think Heather, I don't know if she would say this, but I think she would know immediately. I wouldn't say immediately, but early on, like, had a deep attraction towards me because her faith was more deeply rooted than mine was early on.
Yes.
Then when I got that part of my life,
yes,
I didn't see anybody else besides Heather. And so, I dated somebody else at the time when I knew Heather, but that person was definitely not right for me.
Right.
And you can never really tell until you get to the other person. And I actually just recently saw that individual, and it was so clear. I was like, oh my gosh, I remember the stress and the anxiety I was with that person versus Heather. It's completely opposite. It feels complete because it's not and we've talked about this, it's not a love that she completes. She doesn't complete, like, my heart. God does that, and she's that extra.
Yes.
And that's where it's fruitful, and that's where God wanted us to be. So when I figured that out, I realized there's nobody else. And Peacocks at 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. talks at, post, us still being in college, where I tell her all the time, like, Peacocks is special to us. Like, if Peacocks did wedding ceremonies, that's where we would do our wedding ceremony.
So why do you love Cody?
It's a long list of things, but I mean, the reality of it is his heart and his passion for not only God, but for God's people, his kingdom.
Right.
He has such a servant-minded heart, and he is willing and more than able to drop anything he can to be there for those that, just need help. So that's definitely the biggest thing that has attracted me to him and drawn me in.
Right. Well, it's been also a gift for me to be a part of y'all's life for the last 9-10 months and seeing how much y'all have grown too. Spiritually, I don't know how many times, Cody, we've sat together and you said, may I have a freedom to speak freely, or, may I speak freely at this moment. You and I have had some back and forth, which a lot of people, I think, would not like those things just because there's a fear, but I feel safe within the idea that people are able to just be upfront with me. And so I really appreciated that with you, Cody. Heather, the fact of you finding a freedom in worship and, still being concerned about all the details of it. But once you got into the moment, you were lost in who the creator of the universe was, not whether there was a light flickering. And that's an amazing place to be. So the reason we're here today, though, we go back to that identity, and it has to do with ice cream, Sonic, and a moment where you were pushed, not physically, but probably emotionally, by myself, by Cody as well. And something came out that brought, I would say, maybe a scary freedom. Do you remember this situation that we're talking about?
I do.
Okay.
I do.
So it starts on was it a Friday night, or the night's not important, it started on a night, right? Mm-hmm. That you wanted, so pick it up and I'll tear it apart. I guess we're journey through it.
So it started on a night. I think it was a Thursday night because I was coming from the church.
Okay.
And, Cody had a long day. I had a long day, and I swung by his house, and we just were catching up, debriefing about our day, and I had mentioned that I wanted some ice cream. And, I wanted to go to Sonic, and he didn't want to go. He just wanted to stay in. He was like, I have ice cream in the freezer here.
Yes.
And then we just were talking, and it got pretty late. I had class the next morning, so I was like, I'm going to go.
Okay.
So I ended up leaving about 10:30
without ice cream.
Without ice cream.
So you didn't take him up?
That's not true. You did have ice cream.
Oh,
you did. You had the ice cream that was there at the house,
but not Sonic ice cream.
I didn't have any ice cream.
Oh, we didn't have
because we were talking.
We had ice cream because we thought Sonic was closed already. So you didn't have Sonic ice cream, but you did have the ice cream that was in the freezer.
He did tell me Sonic was closed, but I will say we did not have ice cream.
What time was it?
10:30ish.
Okay.
Maybe 10. And so
I'm just telling you right now, she had ice cream that night.
I didn't know. If we had I need a mute button here.
I know.
I'm controlling it back here.
Okay.
I'll mute myself. Here we go.
Anyway.
Someone
beside
had
the
ice
point.
cream, right?
So I go home, I get in bed, I enjoy my night.
Right.
The next day, wake up, it's a beautiful day. Get done with class.
It's a beautiful day.
It is
I
a
love
beautiful
this.
day.
You're making it happen, right? It's a beautiful day.
And I think I have a dog, and
Okay.
he's an Australian Shepherd, so he likes to be active.
All right.
So I invited Cody to come take my dog on a walk with me.
Okay.
At the walking trail over here by the
All right.
church. And so he was at work at the time, and so
Right.
he met me out there, and we just started walking and then come back. We're cooling off and just chit-chatting. And I don't know how it got brought up, but he was just like, hey, like, I didn't really want to say anything, but I did go and get ice cream last night with my roommate. And I was like, you said Sonic was closed. And it kind of started a little bit of a tiff, and it led to me not being very kind, but also being upset, and him, reacting and
Right.
saying, like, I don't have to tell you everything that I do and all that stuff. And
So it started, you're on this, to use your words, a beautiful day. So obviously before Cody entered in, it was a beautiful day. But then you started walking the dog, and then you got into a conversation. And then that moment, that day, if you can remember, did you walk into the time with Cody already being frustrated with him?
I think I did. We were, I don't want to say at odds, and I don't even know what it was about, but I think we were both, like, it had just been a long week
Right.
of just a lot, and I think that we were both just tired,
Yes.
on edge with each other, so I think we were already both on guard pretty much.
Right.
And that kind of.
And I love adding that, because a lot of couples, a lot of even, y'all will soon be married. There's a lot of stuff we carry sometimes. So we enter into conversations and conflict through situations that occurred in our life against or with one another, but then outside of it. And so you're here, then it ends up, y'all are going back and forth. It ends up Cody saying, I don't have to tell you everything.
And I shut down after that. I was like, all right.
Okay.
And we pretty much ended the conversation.
Where were you at on the trail?
We were actually back at my car in the
Okay.
parking lot with the trunk
Okay.
open, and it got real silent, real kind of tense. And then he was like, well, I'm going to go back to work. I was like, I'm going to leave. So he walked back to the front door, and I got in the driver's seat and drove off.
What was going on in your mind at that point that all of a sudden you're at not having Sonic ice cream? Now the love of your life is telling you that, guess what? I don't have to tell you everything. What did that do to you?
It upset me, and it kind of hurt me, because I don't expect to know everything that he's doing or anything like that, but I was a little hurt because it was like, oh, Sonic was closed. We weren't going to go get ice
Right.
cream. And then he ended up going, and then that he didn't initially want to tell me that. I kind of did take that upon myself in the
Right.
sense of like, well, why didn't he?
Yes.
But also I was just tired of fighting with him that week.
You were that week. And in this came to a moment during premarital. This conversation comes up, and obviously there was a moment that there was something more that you were unable to share with Cody. Cody, you have something to say for sure?
Yeah, so I think we had that premarital. I think that happened that Thursday or Friday, whatever that day was, and then we were doing premarital. I think that was that Monday or Tuesday, that next week, or Tuesdays.
Right.
But you had already known that I was proposing that Saturday.
Yes.
And so
Yes,
Heather had
yes.
no idea.
That's the other thing.
So
I forgot about that.
that's a
Yes,
big
thanks
part
for
of this
adding it.
part of
That
the
is a big part of the story.
was, PJ knew, when we call Pastor John PJ at times,
Pastor John.
because he also doesn't like pastor as well, I think, too.
I like pastors, but just not
So that was a big part of it. So he knew, and PJ sensed this thing. But when we had this conversation, when we were doing premarital, it was different, because you were really talking about us just kind of it was kind of like therapy in a sense. That was like the first 2 sessions, and then I think that was our 3rd or 4th one,
Yes.
I think. And so we were trying to, I think you opened up, is there any discussions or anything? That must have been the Holy Spirit or something that you could tell that there was something that we hadn't fully were good at, or we hadn't like fully concluded a conversation with. And
Correct.
And so, you ask questions like, hey, is everything okay? Like, everything's going on. Like, how's conversations going? And, Heather was like, good. And I like just didn't say anything. And
Right.
then you were like, Cody, you have something? And I go, well, yeah. I'm like, I looked at Heather and I
He
went,
didn't say anything, but his face said
yeah,
something.
yeah.
which
I
is
wanna
always
say
hilarious.
that.
So I look at Heather and I'm like, well, we should probably talk about the Sonic thing. And then Heather looked at me and goes, what about the Sonic thing?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
as if it wasn't. And then I got hurt by that going, what do you mean about the Sonic thing? Like I knew there was something that wasn't dealt with.
Right.
And so we brought it up, and then that's where we are to the current situation
Well,
that happened there.
and I think this is good to mention this. You know, since the fall of man in Genesis 3, it talks about that we hid from God. We started putting on clothes. Emotionally, we started hiding from one another. And doing premarital, I desire to get couples in a conflict, or allows them to see conflict in their life where they're able to verbalize some things about coming back to this moment of, okay, I'm gonna be fully who I am, and I'm gonna share my insecurities. I'm gonna share the things in my life that I've been hiding for a long time, because I think what happens when we do that, what happens is we come together even more because there's trust, and we spend a lot of our entire life not trusting one another, so hiding the parts of ourselves that we're more insecure about. So now we're at this place, we're sitting in the office, and you know, y'all have had this conflict and not really worked through it. And what happens at that moment in the time that we're together?
Well, like we had kind of mentioned, we hadn't spoken about it
Right.
since then and moved on, and then Cody opened up that it needed to be discussed. It was a bigger deal, and I honestly kind of didn't know where to start.
Right.
And you were like, okay, well, explain to me the situation. So we walked through this story, and then after that, you were poking me pretty
I was
hard.
poking you, yes, because again, I knew you were going to ask her.
Which it was all good, and you have the permission to do so.
Permission to poke. Okay.
But I am not good at times with just also processing my feelings and emotions,
Right.
and I like to shove things down and just move on and dismiss it because I don't like conflict,
Right.
And confrontation. And when it's with the person that you love, it makes it 10
Yes.
times harder at times.
Yes.
Because it's an uncomfortable conversation. But I don't know. We kind of I didn't necessarily shut down again, but
No, you didn't shut down, but you were emotionally, there was a response emotionally. Would you say, Cody, that she was responding emotionally within, I think you
I was
set
getting a
up
little
bit
sassy.
more, a little sassy, right? And I said, what else is going on? And I continued to push, and we got to the point of you finally telling me what?
oh yeah, I said, well, if you know, why don't you just say it?
Right. And it's not mine to say. So all of this happened, and then you come to the realization, I think you already know it. Why were you unable to communicate properly with Cody during this conflict?
I had like a fear that he was going to leave me and that that he was just going to be done.
Right. And what happens at that moment in time? What do? You break, right?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I started crying.
And had you ever shared that with him before?
I had not.
Okay. Why wouldn't you have shared that with him? I mean, because he's the guy that's you're possibly going to marry. Why wouldn't you do that?
Out of fear. Also, like, I think saying it is a completely different thing than thinking it. So I can think it and think it all I want, but then when I say it, it makes it more real.
Right.
That is a genuine fear that I had, and sometimes still have to fight, and so I think that was a big part of it.
Right. And what did happen to you, Cody, when she said that? Do you remember?
Well, I think that whole process, why that Sonic, someone that's watching is like, well, why does Cody think we had to bring up this old argument? Well, and we can talk a little bit more about, how I want to talk about feelings and wanting to get into it, and we don't have to. But, I knew that in that conversation, when I said that comment where I don't have to tell you everything, it triggered a response.
Yes, it did.
But like Heather said, she shut down. But I was trying to get, okay, so why? Trying to get the question, why is it upsetting you? Tell me. And Heather didn't tell me.
Right.
And so I was sitting there going, okay, well, if I'm messing up here or something, like, tell me what's going on.
Right.
Later, we found out that Heather didn't know how to, in a sense, communicate that in sometimes, but that wasn't the case in this situation. It was, well, she didn't know that was what she was feeling in the moment.
Right.
But, and once we did the counseling, she knew, but then that's when she didn't want to say it.
Yes.
And so when she said it, it all made sense.
Yeah, it did.
And I think from her perspective, for anybody that's watching or listening, when someone that you love tells you that, the other person's going to think, oh my gosh, they're going to judge me. They're going to sit there. And to me, it made sense.
Yes.
I was like, oh, like that is why you held on to that. That's why that one little thing, I'm not saying she turned it into a bigger deal. I probably turned it into a bigger deal, because I easily could have let it go.
Yes.
But I didn't understand. And I think what couples tend to do is they just see that as an issue. And, I was hurt initially because in the beginning of the conversation, which we didn't talk about, was Heather was talking about something. She goes, we don't need to talk about that. Why do we need to talk about that? And I got hurt by that.
Yes.
The fact that she didn't recognize that was an important moment to me.
Yes.
And I expressed that later in the conversation. And I think what couples do is they go, oh, well, whether it's the guy or the female is, hey, this really hurt me, but I'm going to keep it inside because I'm afraid of what they're going to say.
Yes.
Or how they're going to respond to that. And in reality, if something really hurt you or really affected you, you need to say it and don't keep it inside. And so someone listening being like, I can't believe the guy got upset at Sonic. No, I saw how she responded to that, but then she didn't say nothing about it. And that I didn't understand why she wasn't saying it. So when she said, hey, it's afraid, you're going to leave me, that brought perspective. It brought clarity. It brought some understanding. And her pure emotion, I understood that's what it was really. She wasn't faking it. She wasn't lying. She broke down in tears and was just like, you could tell that was not what she wanted to say. She didn't want to be vulnerable in that state at all. Now it came to, she was able to understand 4 days later why he pushed her to that. And
I pushed her to it. And so what do you think, and I want to ask this again, what do you think prevented you from just going ahead and communicating that, hey, this, when you do what you did, we didn't go to Sonic, but y'all did later. And then we come back and then it ends up you saying, Cody, that I don't have to tell you everything. What prevents you? What do you think prevents people from being transparent in that? Say, man, this is how I feel, whether it's real or not. Whether it's true or not, this is how I feel. What prevents people, or what prevented you?
I would say misunderstanding was probably a big part of that, because I didn't want it to sound or feel like I'm controlling him or need to know his every move, every action, because that wasn't my intention. And that's not what I want, because I 100% trust him and we communicate quite a bit. But I think that it's just really hard to seek that and, to also explain that to somebody from your point of view at times. And
is it sometimes the fact that, oh my goodness, what if I give him an idea? I mean, okay, now he's like, oh, I can leave you? Oh, bye, Heather. I didn't know I could leave you. Now I can leave you.
We live in such a world where we have everything at our fingertips at all times of the day. And so it's like, I used to, and I still don't want to intentionally ever upset him, but we have a lot more discussions and talks, and don't want to say arguments, but conversations now, because if I don't, then we're not communicating and that's going to add up. But if we don't communicate that, we live in such a world where a lot of people do leave and they do choose to step away and to not essentially fight for and work through things.
Had you learned at a point in your life not to be as transparent? I'm not going to say, you were lying, but not be as authentic in communication. Was there a moment in your life that you remembered that you were at, or it's just something you picked up over time that everyone wants me to play this certain role, and once I step out of the role, then I'm not accepted as who I really am?
Yeah, I would say, that's probably, you hit the nail on the spot. Over time you just develop, because we get hurt in all sorts of different friendships and relationships. And if we start out as young kids, we don't know any better. So we're openly and overly vulnerable until our trust gets taken and spread or broken. And then, also taking that and growing up in a where my identity was at,
Right.
of like, I was, happy-go-lucky Heather. Like, I wasn't supposed to have any problems or
Right.
issues. People came to me, with their problems and issues,
Yes.
and spoke to me about that, and I would
Right.
listen, and, I was supposed to be happy is kind of what I thought. So I couldn't let people into really how I was feeling, because I didn't want people, I guess, to see that, I hurt too.
Right. And you have fears, and it's ironic in this sense that there's people that go their entire life in marriages that are unable to share how they really feel, and when that happens, there's not that oneness that God desires. This is a question I have for you too. After being able to expose your ugly or expose your weakness or be authentic in your relationship, did it change your relationship? Did it change the way that you felt and acted towards Cody?
It took a weight off my shoulders.
Okay, a weight.
Yeah.
What's the weight?
The weight of not being fully authentic with him, not being fully transparent with him.
Right.
Because that's just basically another piece that I have to shove down and hide every time there's conflict in our relationship. Right. And I don't feel that anymore. And there's only been like 1 or 2 times that I've like brought it back up of like, I'm having trouble explaining this to you because I don't want you to leave.
Right.
But I'm not going to hide that anymore.
That's good.
Because he needs me to be authentic, just like I need him to be authentic and real with me, so we can figure out our best solution to it, and like how we can move on from things and grow.
Right. And how about for you, Cody? What did it do that day again? And what has it done for your relationship when Heather was able to be authentic and say, hey, I'm afraid, this is my ugly, and this is what I'm afraid of?
Well, I have a list of things that I've talked to with people, with couples, and, since we've gotten engaged, of advice that they have. And the most common one you hear is communicate.
Right.
But I think that's pretty common when you hear with marriages, communicate. But what does that look like?
Right.
Or how do you do that? And for me that day, it was the understanding, and Heather can talk a little bit about this because we had this conversation last week about perspective.
Right.
But it just allows me to, and sometimes I go too much with that where I have to understand your perspective to get this, and that's unhealthy.
Right.
But there are times where at that time I was not getting her perspective at all. There was no input from her on, hey, what's going on in your world, right? And I can't change, I can't evolve, I can't get better if you don't tell me what's going on. So when she opened up, that worked for me too, and I was allowed to sit there and be able to know, hey, I can improve here. But also another thing that helped me a lot here too with this was that, we've talked about it, and I would say between us two, I'm probably the more emotional one, I would say. And you're smiling, but I wouldn't say probably. So yes, I am. And so it's probably why I want to talk more about emotions, and it's kind of just how we kind of grew up. I mean, when we have kids, I'm going to be like the one that's, hey, take them to the hospital. Heather's going to be like, just put a Band-Aid on. I'm like, their leg's broken. Like, they need to go to the doctor. She's like, they can suck it up, But, for me, understanding, we just talked about this beforehand, is I want to have a conversation right then and there, and another powerful, and I don't believe it was the same day, but it was either the before or after, where you were talking about how, Heather, like, hey, how do you express your emotions, or how do you understand it? So you can share, Heather, what kind of you felt, or what you told me when John said, like, hey, when Cody's pushing you, what does that make you feel?
I don't know. I think I said something like, it makes me, I don't know, like my word isn't good enough for you at times, that my response isn't good enough when I'm like, I don't know.
Right.
He still needs me to know.
Yes.
And sometimes I don't.
Yeah. Well, that, and I remember you saying that on top of saying, well, it feeds into he's going to leave me because I'm not good enough for you.
Right.
Right. And so that moment was that Sonic moment, which is funny. So, Sonic, please sponsor us.
Yes,
But
please.
Sonic, we bring people together.
We do.
But
They
no,
do.
that was but that moment was so important for me because it was able to provide perspective. And if Heather wasn't vulnerable
Yes.
in that moment, then sitting there, and I think that's where it's hard is whether it's the male or female, they should push one another to express that feeling. But
Right.
then you also have to take ownership of it too. And I was definitely not right when I said that comment, like, well, you don't have to know everything I'm doing. Right. It was a moment that I was defending in that moment because my roommate came out and goes, hey, you want to go to Sonic? And I was like, they're closed, because that's what I told my girlfriend 30 minutes ago before she just left. And he goes, no, they close at midnight. And it was 11:30.
Yes.
And I thought they closed at 11. And so he doesn't ever ask me. And I went, well, I'm not going to say no to this opportunity. I went, man, Heather's going to be mad at me. But one, I was already going into the conversation assuming she's going to be upset, which she had not ever been control freak or anything. So I was already going into a negative mindset. And then that is what prompted me to say, well, you don't always have to know everything I'm doing. Well, yeah, that's going to not make her happy. Therefore, then shut down. So we both had faults in that conversation.
Yes.
And I would say the preamp was, the setup was my fault, obviously. And I think she would say this, like, the response part wasn't good either, but I can't just sit there and like, your response is bad. No. How I set it up was terrible.
Yes.
I could have just texted her that night and going, hey, I'm so sorry, I had no idea.
Yes.
Which is what I'm trying to tell you. She did have ice cream, okay? Don't think I didn't give her. She had ice cream that night. She doesn't remember.
I wasn't there. So.
Hey, as you can tell, this was a traumatic, and I was kidding, no, and a very impactful moment for me. I know she had ice cream that night, but regardless, that's not what it was about. It was that I felt I had to hide it. And I think that's what sometimes, I would say majority of times, men feel. It's like, oh, well, I need to hide this. Or, and I'm just going to go super stereotypical, right? Like, men, it's like, oh, I'm going to hide this, or I'm going to hide my gambling, or hide, my addiction to this or whatever from my wife, because she doesn't need to know this about me.
Yes.
And then on a woman's side, you could say, oh, shopping or something like that. And it could be totally flip. And
Shopping.
It's not that. Well, yeah, but the same thing though. But which
Or
is funny.
riding bulls.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, that's in there too. But it's funny because I'm actually the one that has the shopping problem in our family too, or in our relationship. But like that's why I say like stereotypically. But regardless, like that happens over and over and over again. But inviting people into that and inviting them and not hiding it, will grow you closer and get some understanding with that. And so that opened up a lot of conversations for the rest of us.
Well, and I believe this, you look back at it and you're thinking, okay, this wasn't a big deal. And I think that was even shared during the conversation back and forth. It's like, oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. But the more we got into it, the more I began to see that there was something there. And it was and how many times we miss the opportunity to be transparent with the one we love that prevents future hurts, because here's the thing, you don't share that then, Heather, it doesn't go away. It's still going to be there. But now it also has the fact that Cody said, I don't have to share everything with you. There's some things that basically it's not how you said that, it's her interpretation. You could have heard, oh, there's going to be times he's not going to share things with me.
Yeah.
And if you don't deal with the insecurity or authenticity of who you are in that moment, it begins to pile. And the only thing basically y'all had going on right then was a dog, and some ice cream. So add a couple of kids on it, add jobs, add stress, add a crazy schedule. And you have this over 10 or 15 years, understanding that, man, I have this fear that he's going to leave me. But now it comes with, well, he doesn't have to tell me anything or everything. There's some things that he's going to do. There's going to be moments that their Sonics are going to stay open longer, and he's not going to take me. He's going to take someone else, and lie upon lie. And I believe God, what he desires us to do, he wants us to expose kind of those weaknesses of ours, because then he's able to, first of all, say, you know what, Heather, yes, Cody's a great guy, but ultimately in your expression of what you said, he really can't fulfill you anyway. So in that moment, you're trusting God more than you're trusting Cody. And learning to do that is super important. But I work with marriages all the time that 25 years, 30 years later, they will not enter the conversation that you went into that day. And because of that, you're building it off of truth, because Cody was able to say, he was able to come back and said, I remember his reaction is like, no, it's like kind of like, what in the world are you talking about?
Yeah.
And which made you probably feel safe. And so it's interesting to think that within a relationship, we're just few words away from taking our relationship to the next level because we're living in truth. Jesus said, you shall know the truth and it'll set you free. Also, Jesus come to give us life and it more abundant. When we do things his way, in that two becoming one, you understanding that you had some insecurity, putting that before Cody is able to come back and reassure you that that's not the case. So a lie that you've been carrying most of your life was debunked or, thrown out because you were able to say, hey, I'm not afraid of being who I really feel like I struggle in being. So with that said, if I would love for maybe one of y'all or both of you there's a relationship out there that the woman or the man feels that they have some insecurities. What would you encourage them to do in the relationship?
In the relationship, I would say find somebody that I think you both trust and that has both of your backs and wants the best for your marriage.
Right.
Not necessarily the best for either one of you, but the best for your marriage. And allow them to ask the hard questions because I won't just allow anybody to poke me and like ask a lot of those questions and to hear a lot of that vulnerability, but have that. And if not that, then you have to be willing to have the hard conversations and trust that, opening up is going to be okay. And that, this person thinks the best for you and wants the best for you, just like you would for them. And try to not think about it negatively initially, because it's easy to sit there and think of everything that could go wrong. But when you sit there, when you sit there and you think about the freedom that conversation is going to bring, or at least a step closer to that freedom, to at least expressing that, and be willing to understand and know that they might not receive it in the best way, or it might hurt them, but it's ultimately moving in the right direction.
Do you have something to add to that, Cody, in the sense of that day or in the relationship?
I think for me, the only thing that, I would say is that the advice for men, young men to, hold things in, don't talk about it. I think that there's a level of that is healthy, because I genuinely do think that, I don't need to know every single thing that Heather's dealing with. Right. And I don't, or every little small detail. Like she is her own person. She is. Right. And same thing for me. But I think we take that, and that's what's natural as humans, is we're going to expand that way far into an unhealthy level. And by not sharing those things, or not sharing those fears, and just, hey, it doesn't matter. Well, it might matter to the other person. And I mean, to this day, that conversation, has drastically changed our relationship. And I mean, Heather, you said it perfect. Like, find that person. I mean, that conversation probably wouldn't have taken place, because either if I had brought it up and I thought it was important, Heather could have shot it down. Like, well, it's not that big of a deal. Right. And we didn't understand at that time how important those people were. I wasn't talking to anybody, and they're like, hey, you need to tell Heather about that. Or Heather didn't tell somebody, and they would have been like, girl, like, he clearly cares about this conversation. You're not seeing that. Yes. So there's always two. I think the biggest piece of advice is that I was told that when something's going wrong, or there's miscommunication or whatever in your relationship, assume you're wrong and go from there. Yes. Assume where you're falling short there. Because you can be sitting there going, oh my gosh, Heather overreacted and shit and stuff. You can say that all you want, but I set it up for her to overreact. Right. Or her to react the way that she did. And that's unhealthy as on my part, especially being the spiritual lead household. That is, I mean, we're not married yet, so that's technically not my responsibility yet, but still, like, to lead her that way and then be like, oh my gosh, can't believe she reacted that way. Right. That's so unhealthy as on my side to do that. And then she's going to sit there and feel trapped, being like, okay, whatever I do, it's never good enough. And we've had those moments recently where I do that, and I expect that, and I set up in a very poor situation, or she doesn't want to talk about that. And that's hard for me to do that. But when you can communicate, I think that's how, and it's just be honest. be honest about what's going on, and we did it this last week, and on Sundays we look at each other and go, okay, how have I been a good fiance is what we say now, but how, because it feels weird to say boyfriend, girlfriend. I don't know if you
right. It's the next level.
Yes, next level. But we say, how have I been a good fiance to you this week? And she'll start or I'll start, and she'll tell me what was important to her, what I did. And last week she said something that I didn't thought was a big deal, but she said, hey, when you texted me about, I think it was your appointment that or something, your doctor's appointment, I just said it just to say it, just to check in on her. But she was like, oh, that helped make my day.
Right.
But if I didn't ask that conversation on Sunday, I'm like, hey, then I wouldn't have understood and known that meant a big deal to her. Right. And then there was something else that I needed to work on. And I allow her to be 100% vulnerable. Hey, no strings attached. Tell me how you felt, where I fell short. And it's both. And we both have to sit there and we take our medicine and both learn. And that's a good just setup for us throughout the week of going where we can go better.
Right.
I think that's great to do early on because we're also not living with one another. But especially when you're living with another, you're going to have more of those opportunities. Right. But if you don't check in, y'all said that too, Christy, it was the check-in daily. I don't remember. It was like weekly, like date, go on a date weekly, and then spend a weekend away.
Yeah, Christy's always good with those little sayings. I don't remember them.
Yeah.
He's like,
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So it's like those help us too. But like the weekly part, I just don't think people do enough of it checking in, because like I love her to death and I know she loves me. But at the end of the day, it's just like our spending time with God. If we're not spending time with one another, then that's not going to happen.
You're right.
And that'll happen too. We struggled with that early, where we would, maybe it was 10, 11, and we hadn't spent our time with God. And we've gotten to the point now where we're like, okay, I got to go home because I got to go spend time with Jesus.
Right.
And if I sit there and go, whoa, you should finish watching this movie, then we know we're in an unhealthy spot.
Right.
But we did that for several months where we were prioritizing each other over God. And then we realized, I wonder why we're having some of these communication faults, because we're not spending time with God.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's easy to get caught up in being grateful for the gift and not the giver.
It's exactly right. Exactly right. And that God's desire, yes, he loves the marriage for sure. He developed the marriage covenant, but one of the goals is to create in the marriage a beautiful example of who he is individually, but also together. Right. And there's a lot of healing that goes on. And that's what I loved about that day, is that it almost, you could see, the leg growing back on the person who doesn't have a leg, and it was awesome to see how he put the relationship together. One being, just sharing authentically their insecurities, but the other would come along and say, it's okay. So, with that said, go ahead, Cody.
Yeah, I just had one more thing, because I thought it was incredibly important, was that I didn't even know this until just right now, but you saw it as a counselor and being married, how important that moment was before we got engaged. Right. Because I think if, I had reacted very poorly to Heather sit there and I called her, you're crazy for thinking I'm going to leave you and doing all this stuff, then Heather rightfully should have been, okay, that's a red flag how he responded in that situation. Yes. Or the opposite, where Heather just chose not to tell me. And then I'm going to sit there and have second thoughts like, she just doesn't think I'm just going to leave her. Like, she won't be vulnerable enough to tell me. And like, it was so wise that we had that conversation before that. I mean, I had already planned it for 2 months, and I knew, and I think that's where the God part comes in, but people are afraid to have that conversation. Yes. And I think you've seen it is, I'm going to tell it here, is if you're afraid to have those conversations with that person right now, then you're probably questioning the relationship already, and that's a red flag. Like, I wasn't afraid to have that conversation or go that deep because I knew it was her, but also, if you know they're that person, then you need to be vulnerable enough to have those conversations. Oh, sorry. Well, like, this is the person that you're essentially wanting and going to need to like go through hell with at times. Yes. You should be able to be vulnerable and open up with that, because they are, I mean, when you are married, your vows are like pretty much through hell or high water. Right. Exactly. We are going to go through this. Yes. So, I mean, you're making a covenant and a promise before God. So choose your partner wisely. And if you have chosen your partner, trust them.
Right. And are you, you're writing your own vows. So are you are you exposing some of your vows right there, going through hell or high water? I think
maybe.
Okay.
Just kidding.
Time
and
does
that's
tell.
where it was just, and I say this is more of a me podcast today than y'all. So sorry.
That's okay.
But like, and I don't think we've really ever shared this, but like I'm not gonna say we were not on great terms that week leading up to the engagement, but we had several hard conversations those 2 weeks leading up to when we got engaged. And I think that was part of my frustration too, because I knew she didn't know.
Right.
And so, and we both knew we were really this person, but we were dating for, what was it like?
I think 8 months at that point.
Yeah, 8 months at that time. So it wasn't like we had been together for 4 years. Now we'd known each other for almost 3 at that time. But, those conversations were super important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you're afraid to have those conversations, then one or two things: you're not ready to get married,
right?
Or two, that's not your person.
Yes.
Because the person that is in your life, you're going to want to have those conversations with.
Yes.
Because you're going to be able to want to see, okay, how are they going to respond? And it's not like I'm going to test them. No, it's if you genuinely love that person and care for them, you're going to trust them, and they're going to either give you that wise advice, or they're going to love you for the way that they are.
Yes.
And I expressed to Heather something our very first date that a past sin struggle that I was not very proud of. And the way Heather responded to that was not out of a judgment. It was out of like the eyes of the Lord. And when I saw that drew me closer, and dare I say, like, she got hotter in that moment, like genuinely. And she did, because I saw that she saw me for, the person that I was, and she didn't just think of me as just a sinner. She was like, I know you're a sin, but I accept you for who you are. And that was so attractive. But if I didn't choose to be vulnerable in that moment, I didn't allow her to see me in that way, then we would have been walking into our marriage in a couple months,
right,
into that moment, and I would have still had that deep, dark fear.
Well, and to close out, y'all are saying some things that are just so dynamic. Right now we're talking about Christ being the head, we're the body of the church, and we're to respond as Christ responds to individual people. The way you responded to her when she said, "Hey, I'm afraid you're going to leave me," you responded as Christ responds, in the fact of saying, "Hey, no, you're safe here. This is something we're doing, and you're safe in it." Just as God has called us to a relationship with Him that will never end. And then when you shared a hard thing from your life, she responded in an amazing way. And sure, it was probably hard for her, but she responded in a way of forgiveness and being able to be visible, or the tangible Jesus, to each other. And I think that's what this has been, this idea of sharing your vulnerability. We're able to show how Christ responds. So y'all both responded as Christ responds to us in a relationship with Him. And that's where the healing occurs. And God wants to do that in our marriage, from the 7-year-old little girl that, had carried this weight for a while. God has used your future, we call it fiance, to bring healing, and vice versa. So super excited about the tomorrow. I get to do the wedding and be a part of that. I'm going to miss you. This church is going to miss you. I'm going to miss you both. And we love you guys.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay.
We have nobody else to do the wedding. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm kidding.
I'm vulnerable. Okay. Thanks for joining us for Inverted Podcast. Hope you have a great week.